Hello and welcome to this exciting webinar hosted by Ben Finkel. This is the Roll Your Own OAuth Library webinar. Without any further ado, Ben, take it away.
Thanks, Jack. Hey everyone, this is Ben Finkel here, and like Jack said, this is the Roll Your Own OAuth Library webinar. Now this webinar is going to act as an introduction to a tutorial blog series that I'm writing for blog.cdtnuggets.com, and the whole idea here is to cover OAuth from a very complete level. We want to talk about not just what OAuth is, where it came from, why it's so popular today, make sure that we understand it fully and completely so that I can help you understand why I think you should be rolling your own OAuth library. This webinar is not going to be able to cover the entirety of the OAuth library. It's longer than half an hour is whatever allowed for us to do. But what it will do is it will give you a very good high-level overview of those things that I just talked about, including what the blog series is going to cover. We're going to talk about where OAuth came from and where it's headed. I think that's really, really important. So buckle up. This is going to be a really cool ride, a ton of interesting information. At the end, I'm going to try to stop about 10 minutes early or so to give time for questions so that you can ask questions and find out more information. All right? So here we go. To begin with, what are we talking about here? We're talking about OAuth, which is Open Authorization. It's a way to delegate or federate authorization. And I'm approaching it specifically from the identity standpoint. Delegating or federating identity is all about relying upon a third-party provider to authenticate the user. So take a step back to the late 90s, the early 2000s. The web was blowing up. Web apps, web applications inside your browser were all the rage. They're becoming super, super popular. And what developers really came to notice is that the authentication schemes were very routine. They were very rote and very repetitive. Every time you wrote another web app, you needed to authenticate your users. And remember, authentication is all about user identification. It's about typing in your username and password. That meant that every web app had to write a login form. Boring. Every web app had to produce a forgotten password flow. Boring. Every web app had to store all this information. They had to do so securely. And every user of all these web apps had to have another set of username and passwords, another set of credentials in order to log into this new web app. And I don't know, I know if you're anything like me, every time I go to a site and I've got to create a new username and password to access that site, I kind of roll my eyes a little bit. And actually, if I can avoid doing it, I avoid it entirely. I don't want another set of credentials. I already have a lot of credentials out on the web in a lot of different places. So when you've written a web application and you want to know who the user is, what they decided is, hey, there's a lot of applications out there already on the web, things like Yahoo or Google or Microsoft, that already have user identification information in them. They've already done this whole process for it. And I could rely upon, I use that word very specifically, I could rely upon those third-party services to authenticate the user for me. And then I would trust those services to authenticate that user. I would trust who they say the user is. This is a great thing on the web. It allows me as a developer of this application here to not have to write all of that code for logging in. And it allows you as the user, for instance, or me as the user, whoever the user is, it allows the user to have fewer credentials and keep them more securely. So there were a lot of different ways coming in the early 2000s. There were a lot of different ways to do this, to accomplish this task of federating or delegating identity to another system. And right around 2005, they started the OpenID Foundation. And the OpenID Foundation, the OpenID standard, was all about creating an open source standard that anyone could implement to do exactly this. There were a lot of closed source ways to do it. There was things like Facebook Connect, and I'm not even sure what some of the other ones were. But OpenID said, you know what, this ought to be an open standard that anyone can implement so that as a consumer, as a person writing a client application that wanted to go through this process, we could rely upon this standard and know that anyone who implemented the standard we could talk to. Well, in 2006, another team was working on specifically setting up API access for Twitter. So they were working with, I believe, a now defunct application called Magnolia. And they wanted Magnolia to be able to read tweets and send out tweets on behalf of the user that was using Magnolia. So there was a person down here, and they needed to be able to grant authorization to this application to do things on their Twitter account. Now, the problem that they ran into is that OpenID didn't really define any standard for this. So they said, you know what? We got to come up with a new standard. And they called it OpenAuth after OpenID, but this was about authorization. So they called it OpenAuth, and then they found out that OpenAuth was not available. I think AOL.com had it. So they renamed it to OAuth, and that's where OAuth came from. In 2006, they released OAuth 1.0. That's 1.0 there. And OAuth 1.0 was an open standard for authorizing API access to what we call protected resources. So the idea here was, like I just described, you could use this open standard to describe how an application, a third-party application, would access your data on a third-party service. And OAuth was very quickly, very widely adopted. Most web apps on the web today implement OAuth in some way, shape, or form. And if you're not familiar with OAuth, it can seem confusing at first when you approach it. And actually, if you are familiar with OAuth, it can also seem confusing at first when you approach it. And that's because, well, it's a little bit of a confusing topic, although it's not crazy hard. So what I like to do is I like to talk through what we call the OAuth 2.0 dance. OAuth 2.0 I think came out in 2000, maybe 2009, 2010. So they updated it a couple times from 1.0. And the OAuth 2.0 dance is all about the flow that you go through when you're doing OAuth. And the reason I want to talk through this is because most of us can understand this very easily. It's a very understandable process. And if you haven't yet been through this, like you haven't read a tutorial or something online, I'm here to tell you that you actually have been through this. You know this flow really, really well. You've done this before, almost certainly. So you can imagine what happens here is the application, the consumer, the client application, I like to call it the consumer, wants authorization to do something on your behalf. It wants to read your Google Calendars. It wants to save information to your Microsoft OneDrive. It wants to read or send out tweets on your behalf. That application it wants to access is called the provider. I marked it with a P there. So the way the dance works is the consumer usually presents a page to you, the user, and it says, hey, I want to read some tweets. I want to read some of your tweets from your Twitter feed, and I'm going to ask for permission to do that. And then it turns over control to that application. So you've seen this in action. It says it's going to do that, and then your browser opens up the Twitter login page. And then you log into Twitter, and then you get a little page that says, where Twitter says, hey, you know what, this application, this consumer application, wants to read your tweets. Is that cool or not? And you get these little allow or deny option here. And you can check either deny or allow, but assuming that you check allow, the process continues. So what's happened here is you've authenticated against Twitter, and you've granted authorization for whatever that application was requesting that it does. When that's done, what happens is the provider sends a grant code or an authorization code back down to the consumer application. Everything else here happens between that consumer application and the provider. So now that you have this grant code, which in effect is the permission from the user to do whatever the consumer has to do, the consumer exchanges that grant code for something called an access token. And then the consumer, oops, I screwed that up there. That shouldn't say that. The third step here is that the consumer passes up that access token whenever it requests access to a protected resource. So in this case, your tweets. So here's what we got. We have our consumer application. That's the application that, for the purposes of this webinar and my blog series to follow, that's the application that we are writing. You have a provider application, also known as the resource controller. This is the application out there on the web that has the resources in its control. And the third party we have here is the user. The user, also known as the resource owner, is the person who actually owns those resources. So those are my tweets. They're on Twitter's server. Twitter is the provider, the resource controller. I'm the user, the resource owner, because those are my tweets. This is great. This is an awesome, awesome way to do things for a number of different reasons. First of all, it occurs entirely via HTTP requests and responses. If you know how to program, and you know how to program on the World Wide Web, if HTTP requests are something that are familiar to you, you have, technically speaking, 100% of the knowledge that you need to implement this process from the consumer standpoint. It's not complex technology. It doesn't require you to learn a whole new language. It uses all HTTP. Another great thing about this is that the user authentication and the grant happens between the user and the provider. Notice this right here, this step right here. It's happening between the user and the provider. That does not have to go through the back end or the server of the consumer application. That means the user is communicating directly with the provider is communicating directly with the user. That's extra security. You reduce the risk of attack or malicious code getting in there. This third step, this is really, really important. Credentials are not shared with the consumer application. So you can think, you're looking at this dance, you're saying, well, it's a little bit complicated. Another way to do this might be, you know what, I'll just plug in my username and password into the consumer. The consumer can then log into Twitter as me and do whatever it needs to do. And, well, yeah, that works. And some applications even do that. If you've ever used Mint, mint.com. That's an application that helps you budget your finances. And the crazy thing about Mint is that they have your bank account information. You key in your bank account username and password into Mint, and they store that. They have hundreds of thousands of users, which means they have hundreds of thousands of users' bank accounts stored on a database somewhere. Wow, that's like a security nightmare just waiting to happen. When you go through this OAuth dance, what happens is these grant codes and these access tokens are produced specifically for this request from the consumer. It's essentially like a one-off username and password that the consumer gets, so the consumer never has access to your credentials. You don't have to let your credentials out of your control, and that's a really good security practice as well. You should never be sharing your credentials with anyone else. Another cool thing about this is that the consumer has to be registered with the provider, another neat security step. So up here again on a step that I've labeled step 1, Twitter is going to present to the user. It's going to say, hey, mycoolsocialapp.com wants to access your tweets. You as the user get an extra verification. You know that you were using that app, mycoolsocialapp.com. You know that Twitter is telling you that's what the application is because it had a secret, a client secret that it passed up to Twitter when it made this request. So you get an extra level of security, an extra level of validation. That consumer is registered with Twitter. And if that consumer is different than what Twitter tells you it is, it triggers you. You know that there might be a problem there. There might be something to worry about. And then the last thing is that the user can revoke this specific grant at any time at all. All of these provider applications, Twitter, Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, LinkedIn, Facebook, now all of them have some kind of apps page where you can sign in and you can actually revoke this access. You can find all the applications that you've granted access to your data. You can see what access you've given them, what scope or what permissions you've granted, and you can click a button and revoke it, and boom, it's done. You don't have to worry about them accessing your data anymore. So you can do all that, again, without sharing your credentials. You don't have to change your password for your site. You just revoke that specific grant, that specific authorization. So how did this all come about for our blog series, a blog tutorial? And it boiled down to the challenges that I ran into implementing OAuth as a user when I sat down to write an application. I wanted to write a consumer application, and I needed to identify my users. I needed an identity provider, IDP we call that. And I thought, well, you know what? I don't want to write my own authentication like I talked about at the top of this presentation. We don't want to write our own authentication schemes. So I said, okay, that's all right. I know about OAuth. I'm going to use OAuth to do this. And I sat down to figure out how to implement OAuth in order to do my identity provider. And it was a little bit challenging. I ran into a couple of problems. The biggest problem that I ran into is that there aren't any really good third-party libraries out there that work the way I want them to work, and there's a reason for that. First of all, RFC 6749, which is the specific specification for OAuth 2.0, is what I like to call a little loose. And what I mean by that is that there are ambiguities inside of the specification. It's actually really, they call it a framework. They don't even call it a protocol. They call it a framework. And what this means is that every provider implements a little bit differently. When you write code to use OAuth, you write it against a specific provider. And if you want that to also be used against another provider, let's say you've written it for Google and you also want to use it against Microsoft, you've got to write custom code. You've got to adjust your code to do that. And in fact, you can see this right in the specification. Rule 1.8 specifically states that this RFC is not going to produce interoperable code. So I went to implement OAuth, and I'm downloading these libraries, and they're out of date. They're difficult to modify. They use OAuth 1.0 when the providers moved up to 2.0. They don't work with a given provider. They don't have new providers that I want to use. Say I want to start using Snapchat as an identity provider. Well, this library is 2 years old, and Snapchat wasn't really popular 2 years ago, and guess what? It doesn't connect to Snapchat. So I'm trying to update and write these libraries, and I can't because they are written by someone else, and I don't understand the code, and they're not well documented. So I'm like, man, what do I do? You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to sit down and, yeah, that's right, I'm going to roll my own OAuth library. So I sat down to roll my own OAuth library, and what I found is that good documentation was really scattered and difficult to find on this topic. It's complex enough that no one really has spent the time to sit down and walk it through what I call soup to nuts. What the heck is OAuth? Why do we do it? How does it work at a very specific level? Even if you understand it at a high level, you get down to some of the weird topics like how to produce state tokens to prevent cross-site request forgery, and you start scratching your head. And you can find all this information out there, but a lot of it is kind of narrow and focused. It assumes that you know all the rest of it, and it just talks about one specific topic. I couldn't find anything to walk you through how to roll your own OAuth library. And there's one more problem I'm going to talk about momentarily after I get off this slide. Anyways, all of this led me to the point to realize that, hey, we needed good documentation. We needed good documentation on how to write our own library to do this. We shouldn't be relying on a third-party library to implement OAuth. Even though it's meant to be a standard, it's too loose and it's too ambiguous and it's too much work to rely on someone else's third-party code to do this. So I'm writing my tutorial series, Roll Your Own OAuth Library. Here's what I'm going to cover in this blog series. The first post is maybe going up today. I got to find out. First post will be up today or tomorrow, sometime this week. There's going to be maybe a dozen posts. It's going to get very, very technical. It's going to run on the Python platform deploying on Google App Engine, which is Google's cloud platform as a service deployment option. The reason I'm doing that is because it's really powerful and easy to deploy to, and it's going to be free. This will be inside of their free quota or their free tier, so it won't cost any money to do that. Also, all the code that I produce will be available on Git for you to download, so you can follow along with the blog series, and you can even use it to bootstrap your own application. Although really, the whole point of this is to write your own code, not rely on mine. So I hope some people will take the time to do that and really go through this. Here's what I'm going to do in my blog series. One, the soup to nuts explanation of RFC 6749 OAuth 2.0. I have dug through the documentation. I've spent the time learning it. I've written code after code after code. I've tested it out. I feel strongly that I can help explain to you exactly what RFC 6749 is, how OAuth 2.0 works at a very resolute, discrete level. What do you put inside of the query string when you make an authorization request? How do you get an access token and a refresh token? Where do you store them? What do you do with them? All these really detailed questions, these really tough questions about it. I've really dug through, and I want to write all that up. I also, like I said, during the course of that tutorial series, we are going to develop a reusable OAuth library for bootstrapping our web applications. Here's the problem with the reusable OAuth library. Like I said right here, it's kind of loosely defined. That means that any library is going to drift out of date. New providers come up, providers change their implementation, your library is going to get out of date. That's why you need to write it ourselves, or we need to write it ourselves. We need to have our own library so that we know how to update it to deal with changes that happen inside the industry. So that's what I talk about here. It's going to be an abstract enough implementation that it's relatively trivial to add providers or update providers inside of our library. It's never going to be easy. It's never going to be quick. It's never going to be fast. But we do need to be able to do it. And so I want to make sure that we create a library that allows us to do it in as customized or as configurable a way as possible without having to write hundreds of lines of code every time we want to add a new provider. And then lastly, this blog is going to help us prepare for the future. ... I left that little mystery ... on there. And here's the reason I did that. If you've been paying attention, you'll notice that I pulled a little switcheroo. I started off talking about authentication, OpenID, identity providers. But I'm talking about OAuth. OAuth is an authorization framework. And you're going to hear that a lot when you're dealing with OAuth. I ran into it a dozen different times in the past month while I've been researching this. OAuth is an authorization framework, not an authentication framework. The problem I had, I talked about the documentation not being great, is people would just throw this out there, but they wouldn't actually say what they meant by it. So OAuth is not a great solution to do what we're talking about here. It's not an authentication framework. And what does that mean? Well, here's what it means. You don't have to authenticate when you implement the OAuth 2.0 framework as a provider. We'll let that sink in for a second, because I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, no, that can't be right. I just saw back on your dance, on your flow there, that the right at that step, the first thing the user does is they authenticate, right? That's what the user has to do. And the problem is by convention, yeah, you usually authenticate against the provider, but you don't have to. There's nothing in the specification. There's nothing in RFC 6749 that requires authentication to be performed. There's just nothing there that does that. So I can't think of a use case, but yeah, it could very well be the case that an OAuth flow did not have any authentication in it. More importantly, since authentication is kind of happening anyways, RFC 649 does not define any identity information to be supplied by the provider. So when you go through the OAuth flow, authentication may very well be happening on the provider's site. On the provider side, there's no rules about what they have to send back to you in regards to user ID. Maybe they don't have the user email that you want to use to identify users. Maybe they just send back to you an internal username, which is kind of useless for us as a consumer since two different users could have the same username on two systems. We can't use two different systems to identify unless we have something that we're relatively sure is unique. None of this is defined inside of OAuth 2.0. OAuth 2.0 is too loose to contain this. And that brings us back to something I talked about right at the top, OpenID. OpenID was created in order to do authentication. Well, there's been OpenID 1.0 that was deprecated in favor of OpenID 2.0. OpenID 2.0 has been deprecated in favor of OpenID Connect. And you can think about it as OpenID 3.0 if you want, but it's not really OpenID 3.0. It's called OpenID Connect. And OpenID Connect is where the industry has moved to in regards to user authentication, federated delegated user authentication. First of all, you need to understand that OpenID Connect is built on top of OAuth 2.0. That's why most of the series is focused on OAuth 2.0. You need to understand OAuth before you can understand how OpenID Connect works. What OpenID Connect does, it defines structures for user identity. And it defines rules about providing those identities back to the consumer, the client application. This is awesome. What this means is that they can create a certification, the OIC certification, which is going to be generally available later this year. And any provider that implements OpenID and meets that certification, you can write a single piece of code, a single library that will access that provider and can use it for identity management. You don't have to rewrite custom code for every provider. It's a generic library, a generic piece of code that you can write and will connect to OpenID Connect providers, and it will provide identity management. So the last thing I'm going to do in my blog, the last thing that I'm going to walk you through, is adjusting it to use OIC when it's available. A relatively awesome and forward-looking feature to add into your library so that as more providers come on with OpenID Connect, and there's a lot on OpenID Connect already, Microsoft and Google are highlights among them. As more providers come on with OIC and get certified on OIC, you'll be able to implement more providers inside of your application very, very easily. So I know that was a lot of information. My last two URLs down here are just the specifications for the two things that we're talking about. I want to answer any questions that you might have about this. I want you to understand that the blog is going to go into much more depth and detail. There's going to be a lot of posts, a lot of information, a lot of code written, and a lot of neat stuff to check out. And with that being said, I'd like to turn it over to you guys and find out if there's any questions. You can key them into the chat box down there in the Ready Talk Conference Center there. And Jack, you're on the line. I don't know if you're seeing any come in.
I'm not seeing anything yet. Here we go, Bruce Osborne. So we'll go ahead and flag that one for you. There we go.
So I think the slides will be available later this afternoon. Right, this whole webinar is being pre-recorded. You'll be able to download and watch it at your leisure. This is Mr. Osborne, Bruce Osborne. I don't want to make any promises. Someone on a different team does that, so I don't know what their day looks like. But at the latest tomorrow, all this information will be available. And then below that, Michael Anderson is asking when the blog will be announced. It's going to be announced on all of the typical CBT Nuggets user feeds. I'll be announcing it on my own Twitter. And again, I think the first post is due to go up today. So it might very well check out blog.cbtnuggets.com. Pay attention to that, Michael, and you'll see the first post. And it's always going to be updated on my Twitter, CBT Nuggets Twitter. If you're a member of the Google Plus study community for CBT Nuggets, it'll be inside of there. Bal Sharma wants to know what language we need to know for this, and he clarified C# or JavaScript, etc. Thanks, Bal. That's a good point. It's going to be written in Python, deployed on Google App Engine. The reason for Python is that I think it's very, very simple and easy to understand. It's very terse. It makes for a good learning language. I think that's why it's overtaking Java in universities as the language of learning. What's great about this is really the technology relies on HTTP RESTful calls. I think that it should be relatively simple for you to translate what I do into the language of your choice. And you can do HTTP calls from any language. It's very easy and straightforward stuff to do. So the important part is going to be understanding query strings. It's going to be understanding HTTP payloads, that kind of thing. If you understand that, you'll understand the code, the Python code, what we're doing, and you should be able to refactor it into the language of your choice. And again, this will be a public Git. If you want to, if anyone feels energized to fork what I do and put it into Java or C# or whatever, I would be happy to see that happen.
And we've got another question from Roger. He's asking which Python version. Okay.
Yep, don't apologize, Roger. That's a great question. I'll be using Python 2.7 because that is the version of Python that's currently supported on Google App Engine. So that's a great question because there are some differences in how Python 2 and Python 3 implement the HTTP libraries, their HTTP calls. So I will be using 2.7. Again, it's going to be relatively straightforward for anyone who knows how to program and who understands the web to refactor it into the language or the version of your choice. Any more questions? I know that was really fast and I covered a lot of details, and I know you want more. Everyone always wants more.
Okay, we've got a question.
Okay, I just want to, how do we implement OpenID? So SK, that's going to be it's sort of the tail end. The last 2 or 3 posts inside of my blog series are going to be about implementing the OpenID Connect protocol framework like I talked about here. You should be able to see that on the slide right now. So we will we'll get that up and we'll get that running, and hopefully in a couple of weeks you'll be able to see that information. Reginald Mellon wants to know if the Git repo is already created. Reg, it is not. So that'll be up. That post is going to go up next, maybe 2 weeks from now. I think I'll be getting into the code. The structure of the blog, the first couple of posts really go into depth and details on what I was just talking about here. So you will you'll get a really in-depth overview of OAuth 2.0 and what happens during the exchange of tokens and what all those tokens are. Then we sit down and we write the code starting in blog post number 4. So next week, or I think a week and a half, those posts will start going up, and at that point I'll have the Git up and I'll be publishing that code up in the Git.
Ben, there is one more question from Roger. Would a CBT Nugget course be created to learn a new subject, but he's not specific on which subject it is?
Yeah, I see that. Roger, if you're referring to this specifically, OAuth and OpenID, there are no, there's no plans to create a CBT Nuggets course, a video course. Although I'll admit I've been chewing on that in the back of my head a little bit because a lot of this I think would be easier explained sometimes in video form or in verbal form as opposed to written. So depending on how the demand looks for this information, this tutorial, I might very well create a video series on CBT Nuggets to complement the blog series. But there are no specific plans for that yet.
Hey Ben, I have a question.
Sure.
I did watch the Google Cloud series, and I remember there were a few nuggets that were dedicated to learning OAuth. Everything you talked about here sounds very familiar to me. Is it the same information as those couple nuggets?
It is not. Those couple nuggets in the Google Cloud series are narrower and more focused. Specifically, they deal with how do you OAuth against Google with Google App Engine. So if you're going to use Google APIs to access Google resources, things on Google Calendar, email, Google Drive, Google Translate, all these different features and functions that Google offers, that's really what those nuggets talk about. And they discuss the dance and the flow. That's probably what you're referring to, what you recognize as being familiar. In those Google Cloud Platform nuggets, I certainly introduce these topics in the dance and the flow. This is going to be much more wide-ranging. This is really going to be all-encompassing because OAuth is an industry-wide standard that you'll be able to, that you can implement. So I want to talk about not just hooking up to Google, but how do we authenticate against Microsoft, Yahoo, LinkedIn, any other future websites that pop up. You know, you can never predict what the next Snapchat or Instagram is going to be. We need to be prepared as developers. We need to be ready to write code that can authenticate against those. So yeah. So to answer your question, that same topic, but those are much simpler and a much less broad introduction to the material.
Perfect. That answers my question. Thanks, Ben.
No problem. All right. Well, if there's any more questions, I think we're going to be signing off here. But if there's any more questions, you're certainly welcome to email myself or reach out to me on Twitter. And I hope you guys enjoy the material on the blog. I hope you find some use out of it. I know I have found it incredibly useful just researching it all. So it's been really helpful for me to learn all of this. And let's get right into some authentication.
Perfect. Thank you very much for all of that information, Ben. And we're going to look forward to your blog posts and future webinars from you. To everyone in our listening audience, please check blog.cbtnuggets.com. We should have the video ready by the end of the day. We typically try to get it ready that same day. If not, check again tomorrow morning. It should be up very, very soon. If you have any other questions, go ahead and pop them up in the chat room, and we'll have someone respond to you as soon as possible. Otherwise, we'll see you on the next webinar. You guys take care.